In my previous video, I shared with you the mistakes to avoid in cut gardening, and today we will talk about mistakes to avoid in container gardening. But before we dive in, I want to take the opportunity to ask you to please subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell button to get updated on my channel. Thank you for your continuous support. One of my favorite ways to garden is in containers. Many people have found how easy and functional it can be. This isn't my only style of gardening, but as far as simplicity, it's my go-to for a variety of plants. If you're new to gardening, have a smaller area for gardening, or interested in using different gardening styles, container gardening could be a great choice for you. However, before you get too far into this way of gardening, it's important to glean from the wisdom of those who blazed the path before you. In short, you should learn the common mistakes gardeners make when using this method. I'm going to walk you through each mistake and how you can avoid repeating it. Here are the common mistakes gardeners make when container gardening. 1. Using containers that are too small. When container gardening, you must get outside of the typical houseplant. You can grow flowers in a container garden, but it can also be for so much more than this. Container gardens can be used both indoors and outdoors. It can also be used for growing flowers, trees, shrubs, fruits, and vegetables. Therefore, you can't stick any plant in any size container. How to avoid this mistake? Look at the root system of the plants you're choosing for your container garden. If they'll become larger plants, they'll have bigger root systems. Therefore, they'll need a deeper and wider container than plants which might have a shallow root system. If you plant in too small of a container, you'll be transplanting frequently because the roots will become easily bound. 2. Wrong type of container. You don't need fancy containers to container garden. Some of my favorite ways to container garden is in 5-gallon buckets. However, containers are made of different materials. You must be aware of your plant's needs to ensure you pick the right material for them to grow in. How to avoid this mistake? If you have plants that like to remain consistently moist, you should go with a terracotta pot. They retain moisture much longer than other varieties. However, if you have plants that need to be dried completely between watering sessions, go with a glazed or plastic container. What your plant needs will depend on the style of container you use. 3. Under or overwatering. This mistake will depend upon the gardener. Some gardeners water their plants and wait too long between watering sessions. Other gardeners worry their plants are going to dry out if they apply too much water. There's a method for watering a container garden if it's vital to the garden's survival. How to avoid this mistake? When raising plants in a container, you should always use the soil test prior to applying more water. Insert your finger into the soil. If it's dry to your first knuckle, the plants can handle more water. If not, wait. The only exceptions to this rule are shallow-rooted plants. Crops, such as lettuce, like to be watered shallowly and remain consistently moist. 4. Not choosing proper lighting. The great thing about container gardens is you can move them. If you have a sunny location in the morning and another sunny location in the afternoon, the pots can move with the sun. However, you must be aware of what your plants need. Some plants want full sun while others only want partial. This makes all the difference when caring for plants. How to avoid this mistake? Some plants want as much sun as they can get. There are other plants which only want partial sun or indirect sunlight. This will cause their placement to vary. Pay attention to this and move the planters where the crops get what they need. If you don't, your plants could end up with too much or little sun. This would impact the overall health of your container garden. 5. Not fertilizing enough. Container gardens have certain things you must be aware of. How much moisture the plants receive is a top priority because you're working with a reduced amount of soil. You also need to be aware of the amount of fertilizer plants receive. They only have so much soil to pull from. Therefore, this can deeply impact the plant's overall health. How to avoid this mistake? When learning how to care for a plant, be sure to investigate what it needs. This will include how frequently the plant should be fertilized and what type of fertilizer should be used. If the tutorial isn't specifically for container gardening, you might need to keep a closer eye on your plant. If it shows signs of distress, it might need more feedings. It's also important to dilute the fertilizer by 50% in most cases when container gardening. 6. Ignoring pests and diseases. This is a common mistake in any style of gardening. When you choose to raise a garden, you must be aware of potential threats for each of your plants. These threats may vary depending upon whether you're growing the container garden indoors or out. However, you shouldn't ignore any signs of trouble in your garden. How to avoid this mistake? The best way to avoid this mistake is by ensuring you take the time to check your plants for issues. I recommend looking at your plant to see if you notice any signs of pests or diseases. If you do, most pests can be treated with an insecticide. If you're concerned about diseases, there are many tutorials through the internet, which can help you identify the issue and help you treat it. 7. Too many plants per container. When you go to a local nursery or start your seeds, do you ever get carried away? I do. I want to purchase all the plants I can get my hands on. The only problem is that you must have a place to plant them all. When growing a container garden, realize you won't have room for an abundance of plants. How to avoid this mistake? There are some cases where you can grow multiple plants in one container. If you're growing a tall flower and want to place smaller flowers around it, this could work in a large enough container. The same could work with herbs. However, if you're growing taller vegetables, it's best to only place one plant in each container. If your crops become overcrowded, they won't grow properly. 8. Using filler material in the bottom of planters. Some people place pebbles in the bottom of their planters with the intention of helping the water drain better. This isn't recommended in most container gardens. Your container should do all the work when it comes to draining water. How to avoid this mistake? Avoiding this mistake is simple. Don't place anything in your planter with the exception of the soil and the plant. This will ensure the water drains away from the plant, and it won't decrease the amount of soil the plant has to draw from within the container. 9. Watering the foliage of plants. This mistake can happen with all styles of gardening. It's a good idea to understand the proper times and way to water your plants. If you water them improperly, you can open your container garden up to pest and disease issues. How to avoid this mistake? When watering your container garden, water the soil. You want to avoid the foliage as much as possible. It's also a good idea to water the plants earlier in the day. This way, if you get the foliage wet, the plants will have all day to dry before the cooler night temperatures set in. Wet foliage and cooler temperatures could invite fungal issues to your plant. 10. Picking containers with poor drainage. When choosing a container for your container garden, it's important that you pick one that's an adequate size to support your plant. The container should be made of the right material to match the plant's drainage needs. It should also be well draining to ensure the plant isn't left in a soggy state. How to avoid this mistake? Look at the planter prior to planting. Make sure the drainage hole or holes are large enough to pull water away from your plant quickly. If you don't, the plant will be left standing in water. This could cause the plant to suffocate over time. 11. Putting plants together with different needs. Container gardens can consist of multiple plants in one pot or single plants in multiple pots. It's up to you and your vision for the container garden. Either way, you must choose plants that have similar needs. Otherwise, they'll constantly be working against each other. How to avoid this mistake? I typically container garden inside my greenhouse. Therefore, I must choose plants that have similar desires for temperatures. If I'm growing a cold hardy crop and a tropical plant over winter, inside my greenhouse, it won't work. One requires I heat the greenhouse, while the other plant doesn't enjoy as warm of temperatures. Pay attention to the lighting, water, and temperature needs of the plants you grow together in a container garden. 12. Not considering placement of your container garden. This issue is mainly for gardeners who container garden outdoors. You must be mindful of where you place your planters. If not, the plants could be left in harm's way, which would waste the effort you've placed into the garden. How to avoid this mistake? Know the location where you place your containers. If you're placing them in a lower area that you know pools rain during a storm, you're setting your plants up to become oversaturated. If you place them in an area where you know the wind can knock them over, you're setting them up for failure as well. Be mindful of the placement of your containers to ensure the elements can't harm them. 13. Not providing adequate care to container plants require the same, if not more, care than plants growing in other types of gardens. The reason is these plants have less soil to pull nutrients and water from. Yet, some gardeners overlook main items most plants need when growing in a garden. Don't overlook the obvious in your plants. How to avoid this mistake? An obvious item many plants need is pruning. If you see your plant becoming unruly or looking leggy, give it a trim. This will help the overall health of the plant, and in many cases, prolong the life of the plant. Be sure you know everything your plants need when growing them, and be sure to fulfill your duties as their gardener. 14. Picking the wrong plants for a container garden. When container gardening, you can't grow every variety of plant. You must be mindful of this when choosing what you want to grow. Therefore, look at the size of your containers and the space you have allotted for a container garden when choosing what to include. How to avoid this mistake? You can avoid this mistake by growing patio varieties of many vegetables and picking dwarf varieties of fruits. However, you should be able to grow most any flower or tree in a container, as long as they don't become too large. This concludes the mistakes many gardeners make when container gardening. Though this style of gardening may be new to some, it's a great way to grow your own flowers or food, even if you have limited grow space. As I mentioned, I love using container gardening in my house and greenhouse to extend grow seasons or produce crops year-round. However you choose to use this gardening style, avoid these mistakes to improve your experience. If you find this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Happy gardening, and I will see you in my next video. Love you all. God bless.